Morning guys, I'm Dave Canterbury with the Pathfinder School, and I thought today we'd continue with our green woodworking series talking about our base toolkit and go back and talk a little bit about carving knives. We did a carving project yesterday, or a Sloyd type project yesterday, and we're going to continue with that to make things like net needles, spoons, kuksas, and other things that we're going to use a carving knife to reduce material from. So I thought a discussion about the different types of carving knives and what makes a good one versus what makes one that's not so good would be a good discussion. So let's take a minute to discuss carving knives in general and the difference between a carving knife and your belt knife. And they're really two different animals. They get confused a lot in the bushcraft community because we try to find a happy medium for a knife that we can carry in the woods that will do everything. And there are lots of knives on the market today that have Scandinavian grinds with fairly thin blades that are full tang, that make a great belt knife or great utilitarian type survival or bushcraft knife that will also do some pretty fine carving work. But in generality, a fine carving knife is a smaller blade, usually 4 inches, usually less than 1/8 or right at 1/8 of an inch thick, many times less. And they generally have either a full flat grind or Scandinavian grind. Sometimes they have a convex grind, but it's usually a Scandivex type grind where it's got a Scandinavian grind that's turned into a secondary convex bevel. I have an example of that on the table from Jeff White. But my favorite knives in general are the Scandinavian or the full flat grind knives because they tend to bite the wood really well up close at a shallow angle. And I think that's important when it comes to fine carving. So let's look at a few of these knives real quick that are on the market today for carving, and we'll look at a couple that I've made myself that are mimics of fine carving knives on the market today, and talk about the ins and outs a little bit and talk about some of these names and models because there's really only a few out there that I'm familiar with that I would recommend to you. And I think that's what's important is, what do I think of these knives and which ones would I recommend for you to buy if you were trying to build a base kit for woodworking. Okay, so let's start this discussion with the classic carving knife that's probably sold on 95% of the fine woodworking sites on the internet, and that is the Mora. And the Mora carving knives have a very small, thin blade, a little less than 1/8 of an inch, and they're very pointed at the front with a Scandinavian grind. There's a couple different handle designs that they sell. One of them is a little bit fatter, like this, so you can get a really good grip on it, and I like this knife really, really well. And the other one is more of the classic Mora design with the handle on it that fits in your hand really well. It's swelled in the middle so it doesn't slip forward, it doesn't slip backwards, which keeps you from slipping up on the blade. This one happens to have things at both ends that flare out on the handle so you can't slip up or down the blade, and I like that really well because I have a fairly big hand and I like a handle that kind of sticks out of the bottom of my hand and the top a little bit, whereas this one kind of gets swallowed up in my hand when I put it in there. But this knife is a very, very good fine carving knife. Now this is a more expensive knife than your classic Mora, like this one. It's got a little bit over a 4-inch blade on it and is your classic Mora design that you see everybody carry. It's got the red handle on it. This one's been sanded off a long time ago and it's worn in over time. You got some hash marks cut in it for better grip in wet weather and things like that. Because I carried this knife in the woods for a long time, actually since about 2007, I've been carrying this knife on and off. So it stood the test of time. It's very sharp. It holds a great edge. It's carbon steel. It does some very, very fine carving. I like the Scandinavian type grind on these Mora blades because you can get a good shallow angle to take very, very fine shavings off the wood if that's what you need to do. Your convex grind type blades don't give you that nice shallow angle, so sometimes you can't get as fine shavings off of it. I mean, I'm drawing really, really, really small shavings off of that piece of wood with that knife, basically just freehand with no anchor point right now. So it's a very good knife for that type of carving. Now this blade's a little bit long because when you want to choke up on the blade to get up at the tip or to do something with the tip, you got a lot of that blade in your hand, and I don't like that. Whereas with a shorter blade like this one, you can choke up on it pretty far up to the tip and not have very much blade in your hand. You've got mostly handle. that works out really well. This one's a little more difficult to choke up on, but because it has these flares on it, it gives you an index point for your finger, and I really like that, where I can come up on that thing all the way up to the tip and just use the very tip of that thing to do fine carving with by pushing with my back fingers, just like this, to take fine shavings out with the tip of that knife and never slip up on the blade or have to worry about that because I have an index point. That's what I really, really like about this knife. Like I said, it's a little more expensive. I think this one runs probably about 30 bucks. But for fine carving work, if you're going to have multiple carving knives, I would definitely recommend putting this one in your kit. This one is a good blade, but like I said, it's just not as conducive to choking up on it and doing fine work, in my opinion, as the other Mora with the bigger handle is. So that's just my opinion on the Moras, and I think this one is a good knife to carry in the woods. It's got a good long blade on it, but for really fine carving work, it's just a little bit too big to do the stuff that you really want to do with it. Okay, let's discuss the Jeff White Sloyd for a minute. And this knife is a Scandivex grind, and you can get in there and you can get some pretty fine shavings with that thing. No question about it. It's a really, really good carving knife. I mean, you can really get in there and do some damage with that thing. And it's really good for taking off, chunks if you need to as well. It's a good utilitarian type blade. It's got a good design, a nice point on it, and that point's important when you're doing wood carving because you may have to drill a hole in something and then carve it out. And we'll talk about that when we do the net needle. It's a nice full tang blade, so it meets a lot of criteria for something. If I was going to carry a carving knife into the woods with me, that may end up being something I have to rely on for other duties in the end. This knife meets a lot of those criteria because it is full tang. It's only a 4-inch blade, but it's heavy duty, 1/8 inch, high carbon steel, so it does a lot of the things that I want to do on the backside, plus it's a good carving blade. So something like this is also a very, very preferred carry for me. Okay, I've got a couple knives here that I created from Mora Designs, and both of these are made from files. Both of them, this one's the one I used yesterday in the project, and you saw how fine a carving work it would do. This is one that I made that I haven't used as much. It's more of a classic Mora blade design. I just actually put the final sharpening on this thing today. It does a good job. You can see it takes very, very fine curls and shavings off that wood. But I haven't had enough experience with this one yet to give it an honest evaluation. But I think just from looking at that and looking at the curls that thing's creating on that piece of wood and fine carving, there's no question that knife's going to be good to go. And all that is a file that I used material reduction. All I did was anneal it, brought it to its softest it could be by annealing it over time, cooling it down slowly, and then I took it and reduced it completely with a grinder to a rat tail tang. I put the initial bevel on it with a grinder and then finished it on a grinding jig with a file. And I embedded it in a sassafras handle, and it's just a rat tail tang that's peened over on the back side and epoxied into the handle. It's not a full tang knife, but as far as a carving knife goes, it's got that nice sharp point on it like a Mora. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick, and it's got a good, nice Scandinavian grind. So I think that this knife's going to end up being a great carver. And I like making tools for myself. Anything that I can make myself, I enjoy trying to do because that gives me more self-reliance in the future, knowing that if I can find scrap material, I can make the tools that I need. So I like working with tools that I've made just to see how capable they are. That brings me to probably my absolute favorite carving knife at this point, and that is the William Collins. Okay, William Collins made this knife for me, and there's a lot of things I like about this knife compared to other knives. First of all, it's a full flat grind. I like that because it can take deep gouges in wood if I need it to, but it can also take very, very shallow carvings in wood if I want to. It bites really, really hard in the wood, okay, because of that full flat grind. So if you want to take fine shavings with it, you really got to be gentle with it, because that full flat grind will just bite in there immediately into that wood. You can take fine shavings with it. It's very, very, very sharp. But you can also take some massive chunks if you need to with that thing out of the wood. Look at that. I mean, that was a huge chunk I just took off of there. That was a half an inch of wood, or a quarter of an inch of wood I just took off of that thing in one sweep. So it will do the job. It's full tang. It's got 3 pins and a curly maple handle. I like the swell on the back of that handle really, really well, and this guard up here on the front. It's a little bit short for my hand. I like it to stick out a little bit further than that on the bottom. But the blade is flexible. You can push on it and flex it a little bit. I like that. I like that because when I'm carving, I like to be able to manipulate the angle of that blade. If I'm doing some fine carving up here, where I'm close and I'm doing those push cuts, I like to be able to push on that blade with this thumb and kind of adjust that angle on a micro level without having to move the rest of the knife. And it allows me to almost bend that knife in my hand when I'm working with it. And something about that I just really, really like to be able to do, because it can take some really, really fine cuts and carvings that way. It's got a little bit of a drop sweep point on it, but that point is really, really good for carving indentions and holes. So I like that. This knife to me would be perfect if the handle was just a shade longer. The blade profile I like, the grind I like, the sharpness of the blade I love. It's full tang, high carbon steel. It's got almost exactly a 4-inch blade. I love everything about this knife. The handle's just a little bit small for my hand, but I have pretty good size hands. So it's not a fault of the knife maker. It's just a fact of, you know, for me, a custom knife that I would make for myself would have a bigger handle, more like this, that when I put it in my hand, it completely fills my hand up, and it's out the bottom and the top. That's why this handle's so big. That's why this handle is so big, because I like those big handles. I like to be able to grab onto something and know that it's not moving around in my hand. But other than that, as far as blade profile and design of this knife, I absolutely love it. I think a lot of it comes down to what is comfortable for you, just like any other piece of equipment. What works well for you and what you get used to is what you're going to fall in love with. Classically, the Scandinavian ground knives are carving knives. In reality, in the Appalachian Mountains for, 300 years, they've used whatever knife they had to do their carving with, or whatever jackknife was in their pocket to do their whittling with. There is a story in Seed Time on the Cumberland of a gentleman who actually broke his rifle stock and carved a new one by the campfire at night with his jackknife or his pocket knife. So the pocket style knife has been the carving knife of America for 250, 300 years. We prefer to use full tang knives now in wood carving, but there are still plenty of good folders out there as well. Opinel makes a great folding knife that's Scandinavian. It's actually a full flat grind, which is a very, very good carving knife if you want a folding carving knife. The carving jack is a good multi-purpose tool, and there's lots of good knife makers out there that make both full tang knives, rat tail tang knives, as well as folding knives that will get the job done for you. It's really a matter of what you get used to and what you like. I just wanted to show you some of the things that work well for me and that I like. As far as price point goes, it's very, very difficult to beat almost free if you make it yourself. Mora is a very inexpensive knife. If you go with a classic, they're around $10 and $15. If you go with their carving style knives, they're more around $30. You get into custom knives like the Jeff Whites and the William Collins, you're going to pay more money for those knives. But again, they're a custom made knife. They're not something that's factory produced. They're custom made one at a time, and you pay more money for that. And they're both American made. So what this boils down to, guys, is just like any other piece of gear for the outdoors, there are inexpensive options that will work just fine, and there are more expensive options if you choose to go that way. Any of these knives that I've shown you today, I wouldn't hesitate to use on an everyday basis. I'm Dave Canterbury with the Pathfinder School. I appreciate your views. I appreciate your support. I thank you for everything you do for our school, for our family, and for our business. I'll be back with another video as soon as I can. Thanks, guys.